The morning air was thick with tension as the M4 Sherman rumbled forward. Staff Sergeant Frank Thompson, no more than 24 years old, sat in the cramped turret, his hands steady but his mind racing. September 19, 1944, near Areort, France. A moment that would soon define him and the men around him for the rest of their lives. The tank's engine hummed, the scent of oil and metal in the air. But underneath the surface was something far heavier. The fear of what was coming. Through the narrow vision slit of the turret, Frank could just make out the fields ahead. The rolling French countryside that stretched into a haunting silence. The sounds of war had quieted for a moment, replaced by the deafening anticipation of the battle ahead. It wouldn't last long. A storm was coming. In the distance, moving like a dark wave across the horizon, Frank saw them. 47 Panther tanks advancing, the pride of the German Panzer forces. Frank's heart skipped. The Panthers were faster, deadlier, and far better equipped than their American counterparts. The Shermans they sat in were tough, but in the world of armored warfare, being outgunned and outvisioned meant death. Frank wasn't the commander. He wasn't the gunner. He was the loader. It was his job to keep the shells coming, to feed the gun as fast as possible while Sergeant William Crawford aimed. But in this moment, his mind wandered to a terrifying truth. The Sherman's narrow sights meant they couldn't see the enemy until it was almost too late, and they needed to see first, or they would die. The German tanks had better optics. They could spot a Sherman from miles away. Every second it took to spot the enemy was another second spent aiming their guns. A second too long. Frank had witnessed it too many times. A German Panther firing first, hitting first, and leaving the crew to burn. He had been in this war for months, and this would be his 12th tank battle. But this was different. Something in the air felt heavy. Something was going to give. And Frank, he had to find a way to make sure it wasn't him. In that moment, he knew this would be a fight for survival, not just for victory. The memories haunted him like shadows in the dark. Frank had seen too much death. Too many friends vanish in the blink of an eye. 11 men. 11 loaders who never made it out of the turret alive. Their faces forever etched in Frank's mind. He didn't have time to mourn them. He couldn't. Not when every moment on the battlefield was a countdown to the next explosion. Not when the next shot might be his last. It was September 7th when Frank's world began to fracture. Corporal David Kozlowski, a young man from Chicago, was loading shells beside him. They'd trained together at Fort Knox, their bond forged in the grueling heat of the tank ranges. Kozlowski's Sherman was hit by a Panther round from 1,300 yards. It came fast, hitting the turret with the force of thunder, ripping through metal like paper. Frank still saw it in his mind, Kozlowski's face, frozen in shock, as the blast tore into him. Frank never saw his body. The fire had consumed everything. For 3 hours, his friend's body lay trapped inside that burning tank, as Frank could do nothing but listen to the crackling of flames, the distant echoes of war around him. Then, September 16th, Corporal James Martinez, Frank's closest friend, was next. The two had survived Normandy together, their lives intertwined in the chaos of the front lines. They'd even talked about what they would do after the war. Open a garage, fix cars, live a simple life. But that dream was shattered when Martinez's Sherman faced 3 Panthers near Bison-Laye. Martinez destroyed one, but it was the second one that came around, flanking them. From 900 yards, the Panther fired. The round ripped through the side of the turret as Martinez was pulling a shell from the rack. Frank didn't even hear the shot. Martinez was gone, just like that, dead before he could even blink. 2 days later, the tank commander came to Frank, tears in his eyes. He'd looked at Frank and said, "If we'd seen that Panther just 3 seconds earlier, Martinez would still be here." 3 seconds. That's all it took. 3 seconds to live or die. Frank had heard it before, but the weight of it was heavier now. The problem was clear. The Shermans couldn't see the enemy first. They couldn't react fast enough. Frank had watched it happen over and over again. The German tanks always got the first shot, the first hit. And his friends? They paid for it. The German optics were simply better. The enemy saw first, fired first, killed first. Frank's survival depended on fixing that. But how could he? How could a mere loader, stuck behind a 75 mm gun, change the tide of war? He didn't know yet, but something inside him was beginning to stir. He wasn't going to be another casualty of the same old pattern. Something had to change, and Frank Thompson was going to make sure it did. It wasn't much. A small, standard-issue mirror, 3x4 inches, with a metal frame. It was the kind of thing a soldier might use to shave in the morning or check the dirt from his face after a long march. But in Frank Thompson's hands, it became something far more vital than a simple grooming tool. It became his desperate attempt to save his crew, to stop the pattern of death he had watched unfold time again. The idea struck him suddenly, like a bolt of lightning in the dead of night. Why not give Crawford, his gunner, more eyes? What if, instead of waiting for the tank commander to shout out enemy positions, they could spot the German tanks before they got close? What if they could see threats from behind, from the flanks, before the Panthers could circle them? Frank didn't have the luxury of waiting for an engineer or a mechanic with a fancy solution. He couldn't rely on command to approve anything. All he had was his hand, his tools, and that small mirror from his shaving kit. It was September 18th, the night before the battle. The maintenance area was quiet and the air felt heavy, charged with the anticipation of what was to come. Frank crawled into his Sherman alone, under the cover of darkness. No one would question him. No one would ask why a loader was working on his own tank at 2200 hours. The night was his only ally now. The flashlight beam bounced off the walls of the turret as Frank carefully studied the space around him. The turret was cramped, full of ammunition racks, fire extinguishers, and the other clutter of war. The gunner's seat was just to his right. Frank's mind raced. He needed to find the perfect spot to mount the mirror. Too high, and it would block Crawford's sight. Too low, and it would interfere with the tank's movement. His hands were shaking. It wasn't from the cold. It was the fear of what this simple act might cost him. If anyone caught him, it would mean court-martial, destruction of government property, disobeying orders. It was a gamble, but Frank couldn't live with himself if he didn't try. His mind kept replaying the faces of his fallen comrades, Kozlowski, Martinez. He couldn't lose anyone else. After what felt like hours of testing and repositioning the mirror, Frank settled on the perfect angle. 12 inches to the left of Crawford's seat, mounted at 45 degrees, the mirror would reflect the area behind the tank. It would give Crawford the ability to glance at it while keeping his eye on the main sight. 3 seconds. That's all it would take. 3 seconds to spot a flanking Panther. 3 seconds to save their lives. With a sense of urgency, Frank rigged the mirror into place, using steel wire from salvaged equipment. Each movement was careful but frantic. The turret felt smaller with every passing second. The metal squealed as Frank drilled into the walls of the Sherman. The echo of the drill bits scraping against the armor was deafening. Every sound, every movement sent his heart racing. But there was no turning back now. Finally, after 40 minutes of tense work, the mirror was secured. Frank climbed into Crawford's seat and tested it, moving from the gun sight to the mirror and back again. It worked. The reflection was clear. The mirror showed what was behind them. Any German tank approaching from the rear or flanks would be visible with just a quick glance. Frank cleaned up, wiped away the metal shavings, and climbed out of the turret. It was 01:30. The world outside was still. He stood there, his mind buzzing with what he had just done. Tomorrow, they would face the enemy again. Tomorrow, the mirror would either save them, or it wouldn't. But there was no middle ground. As he lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling in the dark, Frank's mind kept coming back to one thought. If this worked, it would be a game changer. It wouldn't just save his life. It could save the lives of so many others. But if it failed, he didn't want to think about that. All he could do now was wait. The battle was coming. And tomorrow, he would find out if the mirror was enough. The air was thick with tension as the 0700 hours rolled in. The Sherman tanks rumbled to life, their engines coughing and growling into the dawn. Frank Thompson, still tired from the night's work, climbed back into the turret with the same heavy heart that had carried him through every battle. Today was the day. The mirror he'd installed, his makeshift solution to the deadly disadvantage of Sherman, would face its trial by fire. The battalion moved out in a column, stretching across the French farmland. Fields spread before them, bordered by tree lines, hills in the distance. Perfect terrain for an ambush. Perfect terrain for the Panthers to strike. Frank couldn't shake the image of the Panthers closing in from every direction, waiting to pick off the Shermans one by one, as they had done so many times before. But today was different. Frank had given his crew something they hadn't had before, the ability to see the enemy before they could fire. He just hoped it would be enough. Frank's thoughts were interrupted by the voice of Sergeant William Crawford, calm, steady, but with a hint of anticipation. "Ready," Crawford said, his hands already on the controls, eyes locked on the narrow gun sight in front of him. Frank's heart pounded as he loaded a fresh shell into the breech, slamming it shut. The sound echoed in the cramped turret. He tapped Crawford's shoulder. Then came the radio crackle. The lead tank had spotted movement ahead. German armor. Panthers, maybe 6 of them, moving at 2,000 yards. Too far to hit accurately, but close enough to make Frank's blood run cold. The order came down the line. Spread out, find hull-down positions, and wait for the Germans to close the distance. Frank's Sherman found its place behind a low ridge, the tank commander calling out the target list. Crawford began traversing the turret, scanning the fields, but it was no use. The Germans had already vanished into the terrain, hiding behind trees and hills. Frank's stomach twisted with familiar dread. They had no eyes on the enemy. Minutes passed. The air grew heavier with each passing second. Then, just when Frank thought he might break under the pressure, something happened. Crawford's voice came over the intercom. "Panther, left rear, 800 yards. Frank's blood froze. Left rear, flanking. A Panther had snuck around them, slipping into the perfect position to strike their side, the most vulnerable spot of the Sherman. But then, Frank's mind spun in disbelief. Crawford hadn't needed the tank commander to shout the threat. He'd seen it, not through the turret sight, but in the mirror. The mirror had worked. Crawford had glanced at it, caught the movement in his peripheral vision, and instantly recognized the danger. Frank's heart surged with a mixture of relief and adrenaline. The seconds they had gained, 3 seconds, maybe 4, could make all the difference. The tank's turret began to spin, Crawford's hands moving fast, his finger pulling the trigger with precision. The first round slammed into the Panther's left track, halting its advance. The German tank was immobilized, but there was no time to savor the victory. Another round was already being loaded, the speed of the process almost a blur. Crawford fired again. This time, the round hit the Panther's turret, piercing its armor. The German tank shuddered, smoke pouring from the hatches, and the crew bailed out. Another Panther destroyed. Another life saved. For the first time, Frank felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel for months. Hope. The mirror had done its job. They had seen the enemy first. They had fired first, and they had survived. The battle wasn't over yet, but in that moment, Frank knew they had something the Germans couldn't anticipate. A small, simple modification that could change the entire course of the war. In the midst of the chaos, Frank looked at Crawford, meeting his eyes for a brief moment, the silent understanding between them speaking louder than words. They had just made it out alive, together, thanks to a piece of glass, a few wires, and Frank's refusal to let his crew die the same way his friends had. The battle had only just begun, but Frank could already feel the tide shifting. The hum of the Sherman's engine vibrated through his bone, his hands steady on the shell as he loaded it into the breech. His heart was racing, but his mind was calm. He couldn't afford to let the fear seep in now, not after what they had just accomplished. The mirror had worked. The 3 seconds they gained by seeing the Panther flanking them had made all the difference. But would it happen again? The radio crackled once more, breaking the silence. The tank commander's voice came through, urgent but controlled. "Panther, dead ahead, 1/500 yards." Frank's breath caught in his throat. Another one. This time, there would be no hiding behind a low ridge. This would be an open engagement, a direct confrontation with the enemy. No room for mistake. The Panther was closing in fast, but Frank knew this time they were ready. Crawford was already swinging the turret, searching for the target. His eyes never left the sight, but Frank knew. He didn't need to see it. Crawford had learned from the first engagement. He knew how to react now. He wasn't just a gunner anymore. He was part of the machine, the heartbeat of this Sherman. And together, they were more than just a tank crew. They were survivors. The Sherman's gun roared to life, a massive explosion that shattered the stillness of the field. Frank felt the recoil slam against his chest, but it was a familiar pain, one he welcomed. The round left the barrel with a vengeance, racing toward the Panther. Frank barely had time to breathe before Crawford was already loading another round. The speed with which he worked was astonishing. This was their moment, their shot at redemption. The Panther fired back, but it was too late. The round sailed wide, missing the Sherman by mere feet. Frank's hands were already on the next shell, loading it as fast as he could, not waiting for the gun to cool. This was survival. This was the difference between life and death. With the second round loaded, Crawford turned the turret again, this time adjusting the aim slightly to the right. The shot rang out once more, and this time it found its mark. The Panther's side armor cracked under the impact, and the tank shuddered violently. Smoke began pouring from the hatches as the German crew scrambled to escape. The once unstoppable war machine, now a lifeless carcass on the battlefield. Frank didn't know if it was luck or skill, but it didn't matter. The mirror had worked again. They had seen the Panther before it could fire, just as they had seen the first one. They had fired first, and they had won. As the Sherman rolled past the wreckage, Frank couldn't help but glance at Crawford. For a brief moment, their eyes met. No words were needed. They had done what no one thought they could do. They had turned the tide of battle. And for the first time in months, Frank felt a strange sense of power. A power that came not from their tank, but from the small, simple mirror that had saved them. It wasn't just a modification anymore. It was a lifeline. And they were still alive because of it. The sun was beginning to set over the French countryside as Frank's crew rolled back to the maintenance area, the battle still fresh in their minds. The air was thick with the scent of gunpowder and dust, the smell of survival. Frank felt the weight of the day's victory, but it was more than that. It was the weight of knowing that the mirror, his mirror, had worked. They had seen the enemy first, fired first, and destroyed them. They had won, but in the back of his mind, Frank couldn't shake the feeling that what he had done was far from over. It wasn't just about them anymore. Word had already begun to spread through the battalion, quietly at first, in hushed tones between tank crews. They had seen what Frank's crew had done. They had witnessed the Panthers falling, destroyed by a crew that had seen them before they could strike. It wasn't just luck, it was the mirror. By the time Frank had climbed down from the turret and started to clean up, he already knew what was coming. The other tank crews were talking, asking questions, curious about the modification. They had seen their comrades survive, and they wanted that same chance. Frank didn't have to wait long before Sergeant Robert Hayes, his face tired but eager, approached him. "Thompson," Hayes said, his voice low but urgent, "I need one of those mirrors." His words were almost a plea, a recognition of the danger they all faced. Frank didn't hesitate. He knew exactly what was needed. That night, after everyone else had gone to sleep, Frank set to work again. This time he wasn't alone. Hayes, who had lost his previous loader weeks ago, worked alongside him, keeping watch as Frank pulled the tools from his bag. It was quicker this time. Frank knew the position, the angle, the method. 40 minutes later, another tank had its mirror, another chance at survival. The next day, Hayes's crew faced a Panther. They saw it coming, saw it flanking them before it could close the distance. They fired first, destroyed it before it could fire back. Frank didn't need to hear the details. He knew the outcome. Word spread like wildfire through the battalion. Mechanics, loaders, gunners, commanders, they all started asking about the mirrors. Crews that hadn't seen the battle, that hadn't witnessed the power of the mirror, now begged for it. They had seen the difference. They wanted in. By September 25th, Frank had installed mirrors in 14 Shermans. It wasn't enough. He was exhausted, barely sleeping, working through the nights to meet the demand. But he kept going. Each mirror, each installation brought hope to another crew. The battalion's kill ratio was changing. They were destroying more Panthers than they lost Shermans. The once reversed numbers were now in their favor. The mirror wasn't just a field modification anymore. It was becoming a symbol of survival. And it was spreading from tank to tank, battalion to battalion, like an unspoken promise that death didn't have to be inevitable. Frank Thompson had started with one simple idea, one desperate act to keep his crew alive. Now he was leading a quiet revolution, one that was changing the course of the war, one tank at a time. And with each success, the hope that had once been just a flicker began to burn brighter, reaching farther than Frank could ever have imagined. September 27, 1944, arrived with an unsettling stillness in the air. The 4th Armored Division had been engaged in constant, brutal combat, yet something had changed. Frank Thompson could feel it, even as he worked late into the night, installing more mirrors in more tanks. The survivors were becoming more resilient, their engagements sharper, faster, and, most importantly, deadlier. The American tankers had an advantage now, a simple but invaluable edge that the Germans hadn't counted on. But Frank wasn't the only one to notice. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, the hard-nosed commander of the 4th Armored, was no stranger to combat. He was a tank commander's tank commander, a man who understood the pulse of armored warfare better than most. The shift in performance hadn't gone unnoticed by him. His crews were reacting faster, spotting German tanks earlier and killing them before they could fire. The battalion's kill ratio had shifted dramatically. For every Sherman lost, 5 Panthers were destroyed. The numbers didn't lie. Abrams watched his crews, observed their success, and he knew something had changed. The difference wasn't in the firepower or the tanks themselves. It was in the crews. It was in their ability to see the enemy before the Germans could even aim. On September 27, Abrams conducted a standard inspection of the tanks, a routine check for maintenance and readiness. He climbed into Frank's Sherman first, looking it over with a trained eye. Everything seemed normal, until he noticed it. The small mirror, mounted to the left of the gunner's seat, catching the light of the morning sun. He stared at it for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Frank's heart raced. He knew what would come next. He had broken regulations. He had installed the mirrors without permission. He had taken matters into his own hands. The punishment for such an offense could be severe, and the fear of a court-martial hung over him like a dark cloud. But Abrams didn't speak immediately. He simply asked, "What is this?" Frank stood at attention, knowing there was no hiding it. He could have lied, could have claimed ignorance, but instead he said, "It's a modification, sir. We did it ourselves. It helps the gunner see threats from the rear and the flanks. It saved us." Abrams didn't speak for a moment, processing what Frank had said. Then, to Frank's surprise, he asked, "Who authorized it?" "No one, sir," Frank replied. "We did it on our own." The silence between them was thick. Abrams climbed out of the turret, his boots scraping against the metal. Frank's heart pounded in his chest. Was this it? Would he be arrested? Court-martialed? Would his entire crew be dragged into the mess? But then, Abrams did something Frank never expected. "You have 48 hours to install one of these mirrors in every tank in the battalion," he said firmly. "I'll handle the paperwork. You focus on keeping my crews alive." Frank blinked, his mind racing. This was not what he had anticipated. But Abrams wasn't done. "This needs to be done, Thompson. These mirrors work. I've seen the results, and I want every crew to have one. Make it happen." In that moment, Frank's world shifted again. The small, illegal modification, the one that had started with just one desperate act of survival, was now sanctioned. It was no longer just Frank's secret. It was now the Army's new lifeline. Frank didn't care about the paperwork, the regulation, or the recognition. All that mattered was that the mirror, a piece of glass and wire, was going to save even more lives. That night, Frank worked faster than ever, recruiting other mechanics to help him install the mirrors. No longer was he working alone. The battalion's survival was now in his hands, and Frank Thompson wasn't about to let them down. What had started as a simple act of defiance had blossomed into a tactical advantage that could change the entire war. And as word spread, other divisions began to take notice. The modification traveling from tank to tank, battalion to battalion, until it became a symbol of the American resolve in the face of overwhelming odds. In the midst of chaos, Frank had found a way to fight back, and now the Army was finally recognizing it, not as a rebel's desperate act, but as a vital tool in the fight for survival. The war ended on May 8, 1945, and with it, the roar of battle faded into the quiet of Europe's shattered landscape. For Staff Sergeant Frank Thompson, the end of the conflict brought a strange sense of finality. He had survived, but so many others hadn't. And though the war was over, the scars of it would last forever, etched in the memories of men like him who had seen things no one should ever have to witness. Thompson's Sherman had rolled through the streets of Czechoslovakia when the Germans finally surrendered. He had seen the horror, the destruction, and the camaraderie that had been forged in blood. But now, with the war over, the battles within him began. The quiet war that no one spoke about. The war for recognition, for acknowledgement, for the truth of what had been done. Frank had never sought fame or medals. His focus had always been on the crew, on keeping his men alive, on ensuring that no one else died in the same way his fallen friends had. But when the war ended and the tanks rolled into a Europe that was slowly rebuilding, Frank found himself slipping into the shadows, his role in the tank battles now a mere footnote. The mirror that had saved so many lives, the simple innovation born out of desperation, faded from history. It wasn't long before the Army shifted focus. Its attention turned toward the grand narratives of battle, the generals, the larger strategies, the iconic victories. Frank Thompson's name wasn't written in the official reports. His mirror, a humble field modification, was eventually attributed to engineers who had improved Sherman optics, as if the modification had sprung from some lab, a manufactured solution rather than the product of a soldier's ingenuity and a desperate desire to survive. In the years that followed, Frank returned to his small town in Pennsylvania. He worked in a steel mill just as he had before the war. His life, as it was, felt like a quiet echo of something far louder, something far more significant. He married, had 2 daughters, and lived a modest life, keeping the ghosts of the war buried deep inside. When people asked about his service, he told them simply, "I was a loader in a tank." That's all. He never mentioned the mirror, never spoke of the countless lives it had saved. He didn't need to. To him, it had always been about the crew, about keeping them alive, about saving them no matter the cost. That was his purpose. And yet, as history marched on, Thompson's legacy remained forgotten, lost in the bureaucratic shuffle of post-war life. It wasn't until decades later, in 1992, that his name resurfaced in the most unlikely of places, a historian's research. Through long interviews with veterans and painstaking research, the true story of the mirror and of the man who had dared to break the rules to save his comrade began to emerge. But even then, the recognition was fleeting. A small article in a military history journal, a handful of letters from veterans whose lives had been spared. Frank received no medals, no fanfare, no official acknowledgement. And in the end, when Frank passed away in 2003, his obituary, while mentioning his service in World War II, never mentioned the mirror, never spoke of how his quiet innovation had altered the course of tank warfare. It was as if the Army had erased him from history. Not intentionally, but because history is written by the loudest voices, not the quiet ones who simply do what needs to be done. For Frank, that was enough. He had saved his crew. He had done what was right. And when he left this world, he knew that the men who had survived, Crawford, Hayes, and so many others, would remember. He didn't need anyone else to. His legacy lived in their survival, in the fact that they had made it home, not as statistics, but as men who had faced the impossible and lived to tell the tale. Years passed, and the memory of the war began to fade, buried beneath the weight of new generations, new stories, and the endless march of time. But history has a strange way of resurfacing, of dragging the forgotten back into the light when least expected. Frank Thompson's story, the quiet revolution he started with nothing but a small mirror and a desperate hope to keep his crew alive, had been lost in the cracks of history. But in 1992, that forgotten legacy would finally find its way back into the world. It started with a historian, a man driven by a singular mission to uncover the stories of World War II's unsung heroes. While combing through maintenance logs in the National Archives, the historian stumbled across a name, Frank Thompson. It was a name buried deep in the records, a mere mention of a tank crewman from the 4th Armored Division. But it was enough. Thompson's name, his crew's survival, and the mysterious reference to a mirror modification caught the historian's attention. Intrigued, the historian set out to dig deeper. Through interviews and research, he pieced together the fragments of the story. What he found was more than he had ever imagined. A story of a soldier who had seen his friends die in the same way over and over. A soldier who had refused to accept that fate. A soldier who had done something no one else dared to do. Frank Thompson's mirror wasn't just a field modification. It had saved lives, hundreds of them. It had changed the course of tank warfare, giving the crews of Sherman tanks a fighting chance against the superior German Panthers. The historian tracked down veterans from the 4th Armored Division, slowly unearthing pieces of the story that had long been forgotten. He found Crawford, Frank's gunner, who had survived because of that simple modification. Crawford remembered the day the mirror saved them, how they had seen the Panther flanking them, and had destroyed it before it could fire. Crawford spoke of Thompson in hushed, reverent tones, remembering the man who had risked everything to keep him, and so many others, alive. Eventually, the historian found Frank, now 74 years old, living a quiet life in Pennsylvania, still working part-time in his garage. Frank at first was reluctant to relive the past. He had never talked about the mirror, never sought recognition. To him, it had simply been about survival. He had done what needed to be done. But when the historian explained how the story was beginning to be pieced together, Frank reluctantly opened up. He spoke of the fear, the desperation, and the drive to do something, anything, to save his friends. The historian published his findings in a military history journal in 1994, a small article that credited Frank Thompson and his mirror modification. The piece reached a niche audience, veterans, academics, and military enthusiasts. But to those who read it, Frank Thompson's name was no longer just another forgotten soldier. He was a hero, a man who had done what no one else would, saving lives without asking for anything in return. The rediscovery of Frank's story was a quiet one, but it was real. 3 letters arrived at his doorstep after the article was published. One from a former tank commander, another from a loader in the 6th Armored Division, and the last from a museum curator, all thanking Frank for his contribution to their survival. Frank never cared about the letters. He never cared about fame. But the recognition was a bittersweet reminder that his story, the story of the mirror, of his quiet defiance and his unwillingness to accept death as an answer, had finally been told. And for Frank Thompson, that was enough. The men who had survived because of him would never forget. The historian had unearthed a piece of history that was nearly lost forever, and in doing so, ensured that Frank Thompson's legacy would never fade again. When the war ended, Frank Thompson returned home to a life that was, in many ways, quieter than the one he had left behind. After the tanks had rolled into Czechoslovakia and the final shots had been fired, there was no grand parade, no medals, no acknowledgement of the heroism that had quietly saved countless lives on the battlefield. The war had taken enough from Frank, his friends, his innocence, his youth, and in its wake, he had nothing left to do but rebuild. He settled into a small town outside of Pittsburgh, the familiar hum of a steel mill filling the air as he joined the workforce once again. He had been a steel mill worker before the war, and it was all he knew. His hands, once calloused from loading shells into a Sherman, now found the same rhythm in the molten heat of steel. The work was hard, but it was honest. It allowed him to forget, if only for a moment, the horrors of the war. It gave him something to focus on, something that had nothing to do with death and destruction. Frank married in 1948. He had 2 daughters, and for the rest of his life, he kept his past buried deep inside. His children knew that their father had served in World War II, but they never knew the full extent of what he had done. They never knew that it was Frank who had created a field modification that saved hundreds of lives, a small mirror that turned the tide of battle. They didn't know the man who had been the quiet architect of a shift in tank warfare, the one who had risked everything to keep his crew alive. Frank never spoke of it. His life was simple, unremarkable to those who didn't know. He didn't need recognition. He had done what he had to do, and the lives that had been saved because of that mirror were payment enough. Frank didn't want the spotlight. He didn't want medals. He didn't want the world to know. His mind would often wander back to the faces of the men who hadn't made it out of those battles. Kozlowski, Martinez, and the others. They were the ones who had paid the price. Not him. Frank never sought glory. He never sought fame. The most he ever received was a small, inconspicuous letter or two, a thank you from men whose lives had been spared, a quiet acknowledgement that somehow his name had found its way into the story. He kept those letters tucked away in a drawer, out of sight. To him, they were just reminders of a time he would rather forget. In the steel mill, among the hum of machines and the heat of the furnaces, Frank continued his work. His daughters grew up without knowing their father's full story. Frank was the quiet, hard-working man who provided for his family, who never complained, who never talked about the past. The world moved on. New generations came and went. The memory of the war began to blur for everyone except those who had lived it. Frank's contribution, his mirror, his quiet act of defiance, was forgotten by most. But not by Frank. He had saved his crew. That was all that mattered to him. And as the years passed, his name became little more than a whisper, lost in the noise of history. He never needed recognition. He never wanted it. And when he passed away in 2003, at the age of 84, it was as quietly as he had lived his life. His obituary, though it mentioned his service in World War II, made no mention of the mirror that had saved hundreds of men's lives. His legacy was there, in the lives he had touched, but it was hidden, just as he had wanted it. In the end, Frank Thompson's life was a testament not to the recognition he never sought, but to the quiet, unwavering courage of a man who did what had to be done. Frank Thompson's final years were a quiet echo of the life he had lived after the war. Steady, unremarkable, and full of routine. He had never sought the limelight, never wanted recognition for what he had done during the war. To him, it had always been about survival, his crew's survival. It wasn't about medals or glory or praise. It was about keeping the men around him alive, and he had done that to the best of his ability. After the war, Frank had embraced the slow, steady rhythm of life in small-town Pennsylvania. He worked in the steel mill, spent evenings tinkering in his garage, and lived a life that, on the surface, appeared entirely ordinary. He had a wife, 2 daughters, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing he had done something that mattered, something no one would ever fully understand. The war had taken so much from him, but it had also given him a life of simplicity. No fanfare, no recognition, just the quiet, unspoken understanding that he had done what he had to do. He had saved lives. Yet even in the peace of those later years, the past never fully left him. The faces of the men who had died, Kozlowski, Martinez, and so many others, remained with him, haunting his dreams. But Frank didn't talk about the war. He didn't need to. His children knew he had served, but they didn't know the true story of his time in combat, the mirror that had saved lives, the desperate acts of a man who had refused to let his friends die. His life was one of quiet service, not for recognition, but for those who had been by his side. In 1996, a visitor came. Frank hadn't seen him in years. It was Crawford, his gunner, the man who had been with him through it all, the man who had lived because of the mirror. Crawford drove from Detroit to Pennsylvania, a journey of hundreds of miles, to sit with Frank again. They hadn't seen each other for 4 decades, but the bond between them, forged in the heat of battle, was as strong as ever. For hours, they sat in Frank's garage, talking about the war, about the mirror, about the men they had lost, and the ones they had saved. "I've tried for years to get you recognized," Crawford told him, his voice full of frustration and admiration. "I've written letters, tried to make sure people knew what you did, but nobody cared." Frank smiled gently, the same humble smile he had worn all his life. "I didn't do it for recognition," he said simply. "I did it to keep you alive." It was the last time the 2 men would speak of the war, and for Frank, it was enough. Recognition had never mattered to him. All that mattered was that Crawford had survived, that the others had made it home, and that he had played a part in making sure they did. Frank Thompson passed away on March 14, 2003, at the age of 84, from heart failure. The world remembered him as a veteran, a quiet soldier who had served in World War II. But his story, the full story of his bravery, his ingenuity, and the lives he had saved, remained untold, lost in the sweep of time. At his funeral, 3 men who didn't know him personally attended. They had read about Frank's death in a veteran's newsletter and came to pay their respects. These were men whose lives had been saved by the mirror Frank had installed in their tank. They were the men who remembered what Frank had done, even if the world had forgotten. For Frank, that was all the recognition he needed. Frank Thompson's story was one of quiet defiance and unimaginable courage, a story nearly lost to time, but one that still echoes in the lives of those who survived because of him. The small mirror he had installed in his Sherman tank was more than just a simple modification. It was the difference between life and death for hundreds of American tank crews. Its impact rippled through the course of the war, changing how tank battles were fought and saving countless lives in the process. But its true legacy wasn't just in the immediate survival of men like Frank's crew. It was in how it fundamentally altered the way American soldiers approached tank warfare. In the years after the war, the memory of Frank's mirror began to fade, buried under the weight of history and overshadowed by the larger stories of generals and iconic battles. The official military records failed to recognize Frank for what he had done. Instead, engineers and ordnance departments took the credit for what had begun as a soldier's desperate, illegal attempt to save his crew. Frank never sought recognition. His focus had always been simple: survival. And for those who survived, that's all that mattered. Yet, the mirror's impact couldn't be erased. In the aftermath of the 4th Armored Division's success with the modification, the word began to spread. Tank crews across different divisions adopted the mirror, and by October 1944, over 300 Shermans had been retrofitted. The simple solution Frank had crafted in the dead of night, a small, salvaged mirror, mounted at just the right angle, allowed tank gunners to spot threats from behind and from the flanks, reducing the Germans' tactical advantage and shifting the balance of tank combat. By the time the war ended, Frank's mirror had become a standard feature across American armor units. The modification spread from battalion to battalion, division to division, with every Sherman now equipped with the same life-saving tool. It didn't cost the Army a dime. It wasn't a breakthrough born from the polished halls of engineering. It was a product of the battlefield, the ingenuity of a soldier who had faced death time and again and refused to let it take any more of his friends. In the years that followed, new tank designs came with better optics, better sighting systems, and improved technology. The Sherman eventually became obsolete, but the lesson Frank taught, sometimes survival doesn't come from the most advanced technology, but from a willingness to think differently, to break the rules when the stakes are life and death, remained. Though Frank never sought recognition, his story was rediscovered decades later by a historian. And while the Army tried to claim credit for the mirror's design, the real legacy was in the men who lived because of it. Over 200 soldiers, perhaps more, would not have made it back home without the simple innovation of a desperate loader. When Frank passed away in 2003, his name had finally been unearthed, but it was more than just his name that lived on. It was the mirror, a symbol of resourcefulness, of the kind of soldier who doesn't wait for permission when lives are on the line. Frank Thompson may have been forgotten by many, but his legacy is a reminder that sometimes the smallest innovations, born from necessity and courage, can change the course of history.